Hey everyone, this is Will from Charlotte, North Carolina, and welcome to this brand new and exciting episode of The Missing Piece. Now, over the weekend, if you follow the news closely, Emmanuel Macron successfully secured another 5 years of his presidency. So which means for the following 5 years, Macron will continue to lead the country and its people onto another, what he called, anti-establishment political path. But meanwhile, as the whole world is focusing on the celebration and the anticipation of Emmanuel Macron, but we also need to talk about another country is strategically located in the continent of Europe, which is Germany. And as we know that not too long ago, the former Chancellor Angela Merkel stepped down from her position, and the successor is called Chancellor Scholz. It looks like he's going to take the country onto a new path. So that's why today it's so important in this episode, and we need to talk about where this brand new chancellor is leading the country and why some experts is calling that the party within Germany today, it somehow is having this mixed message regarding the political identity. So that's why today, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite an author, James Hawes, to the show. And again, he's the author of the book called The Shortest History of Germany from Julius Caesar to Angela Merkel. And again, James and I were going to talk about this amazing article he wrote and also something deeper beyond this article. Without further ado, James, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Well, it's great to be with you here from England.
Thank you. Now, again, as I mentioned in the intro, this is something that is so critical and urgent that we need to discuss at this moment. Not too long ago that you wrote this article, and the article is entitled, "The Real Reason Germany is Always Afraid. Berlin Hesitate on Everything Because of its Ruling Party's Identity Problems." Now, can you help us to understand from this fundamental level, what does that mean when you say this political party today, it's suffering or it's struggling with this identity problems? What is your take on that?
Well, I think the most important thing for a transatlantic listener to understand about German politics, and it should be quite easy for you guys over there, is that German politics is not really national any more than US politics. Germany is split into what you guys would probably call red or blue states, just as profoundly. And in fact, if you think about it just for a moment, the phenomenon of a united Germany is very recent. It's only 1 year after the Battle of Gettysburg. Prussia, which had been an entirely separate country for the whole of German history, defeated all the rest of Germany in what historians often wrongly call the Austro-Prussian War. In fact, every one of the 4 German kingdoms, apart from Prussia, backed Austria, and they kept on fighting even after Austria got catastrophically defeated at the famous Battle of Königgrätz, the biggest battle in Europe between Napoleon and the First World War by a mile. Now, so in other words, at exactly the same time as you guys had just about finished your fight, well, if you ever really did, about the belonging as a one nation United States, the Germans were just entering on that period. And for the next 20 years, Germany was dominated by what you might say is a kind of German form of reconstruction, where the new Prussian rulers who'd won their civil war tried to impose their culture on the much older Catholic south of Germany. And that's the vital thing for foreigners. And I don't just mean Germans. English people don't understand this either. Germany is fundamentally split between the very ancient Catholic West, which was thoroughly Romanized by the Roman Empire, and the much younger East, which was not even German till about 1200 AD, which was always characterized by this notion of a conflict or a need to make a deal with the Slavic tribes, which would later on coalesce into Russia. That's all. So you have 2 Germanies with entirely different existential imperatives. On the one hand, the old Catholic West, whose imperative is basically to get along with France, or at times to resist France. On the other hand, the much younger colonial East, which has always had, Polish and Czech minorities in it, whose existential imperative has always been, we either have to whip the Russians or do a deal with them. And those are the two totally different strands in German politics. And without that, you can't, if your listeners just take a look at any map of a German election, you will see it is just as striking as the red blue states in America. Geography really is fate in this case too. Now, the problem we have now in Germany is that historically, and I'd love it if we could just say to your readers, hey, quickly, call up on Wikipedia the map of the German elections, the German Reichstag elections 1912, say, just before the First World War. Maybe your listeners would like to do that for themselves. And you will see there are essentially three blocks before the First World War. The east of Germany is far bigger then, don't forget. It went right to the Germany before the First World War, went right over into what's present-day Russia. In fact, my father-in-law was brought up there in the 1930s, and it was still very much colonial, like the antebellum South. The Germans were a minority who ruled over Slavic minorities ruthlessly right up to the 1930s. It wasn't invented by the Nazis. The Nazis loved that idea. It was their blueprint for what they called, the New World Order. So you had the east of Germany going right over into present-day Russia, where everybody always voted for their own tough guys. Because guess what? They're a colony. They're scared of a kind of uprising of the underlings. So they vote for authoritarians. In the west, you have the ancient Catholics. Now, this leaves one block in the middle. Once Germany's united, there's this curious block, the North German Protestants. They are not, and never have been, colonial Prussians. They're not, and never have been, ancient Catholic Southerners. So what are they? They've only existed since Martin Luther's time and never had a state of their own. And they are the guys who are caught in the middle. They are the people who, and I think this is a thought your listeners might be interested in, they will adopt an ideology, the ideology of socialism. I think there's a really strong and interesting argument as a kind of take-home from this for your listeners. Is it possible that it's only cultures which don't have a strong identity which need ideologies? You think about the truly powerful countries of world history, they never really had what we would call a political ideology. Political ideologies are for cultures which are not really sure of themselves. So in the course of the 19th century, these new North German Protestants, remember the states only existed since 1871, they adopt international socialism as their kind of ersatz identity. So they say, okay, we're not Catholic Germans, we're not Prussian Germans, we're going to be like everywhere Germans, we're going to be international Germans. And people like Lenin and Stalin believe that the world revolution is going to be led by these guys because they're the biggest, and the best funded social democrat party in the world. The problem for today's social democrat party, in a nutshell, is they are the heirs of that. And they have never truly, as I say it with great regret, they have never truly abandoned their roots in this kind of Marxist ideology. They still have this kind of knee-jerk idea of respect for Bolsheviks, for revolutionaries who may be violent, for that notion of a socialist international brotherhood, which frankly was always a mad dream and is way, way out past its sell by now. And that's their problem now.
James, it's so interesting today. Again, that's the reason why when I started the intro and the topic regarding the country of France, for so long, I'm sure that you as an author and also as a historian, that we believe there were, should I say there's a much greater purpose for someone as Emmanuel Macron got elected, for his second presidency, because again, for so long that he was called this anti-establishment. So in other words, he was trying to bring these fresh new ideas coming to the political arena. But meanwhile, again, James, you focus on this identity, this political identity in Germany. We know that for so long that Angela Merkel, she was the chancellor, and she was trying really hard to lead the country onto this different path. I guess you could call it religious path or Christian path or, this internationalism. But as soon as the position was taken over by Scholz, and it seemed the country is guiding or is being guided towards another direction. So from your perspective, James, how does the current chancellor how is the current chancellor different from the political ambition comparing with Angela Merkel?
Well, in fact, in the most vital question of the moment, Ukraine and Russia, he actually differs very little from her because, and I was a great fan of Merkel, and I wrote a sort of valediction for her last year for one of the big English newspapers. But even then, I pointed out back in September, she has left Germany at the mercy of Russian energy blackmail. I, along with most people, did not realize just how soon and how serious that was going to be. Scholz has, in a sense, inherited that problem from her, but it's totally tied up with his own party. The now notorious Gerhard Schröder, who is the last German Chancellor from the SPD, from Scholz's party, is of course well known now to be completely networked in with, he's on the board of Gazprom, for Christ's sake. He's an absolute Putin fan, a paid up servant of the Russian military oligarchy and Putin's state. And so that cozy relationship was dangerous enough under Merkel, but it's far more. It seems to be far more crippling to German foreign policy under a party which has this kind of instinctive knee-jerk, which I'm sorry to say includes a large amount of anti-Americanism. It always has had that. Now, post-war Germany, the modern Germany, originally, of course, much smaller than it is now until 1990, was dominated by the CDU, the heir of the Catholic Centre Party, under the great Chancellor Adenauer, the father of modern Western Germany, who made no bones about it. We are of the West, he said. He didn't even want the East Germany back, in fact. He was absolutely convinced that the alliances with France and America had to be both maintained, the absolute keystones. And that's what was really what anchored America into Europe and vice versa. But from the 1960s onwards, and it's interesting, it's 1969, it's the birth of that sort of boomer generation in politics. The SDP first came back to power after the Second World War, and they came back on a kind of implicitly anti-American ticket. They called it Eastern politics. What it meant was, at least by implication, they were gently going to break ranks with the commitment to NATO and pursue an independent foreign policy with Russia, which, interestingly, from the very start, was a swap of energy for technology. This goes right back to 1970. So ever since then, particularly the SDP, but also, unfortunately, Merkel as well, have pursued this sort of goal, which is putting Germany's relationship with Russia in a kind of separate box from its relationship with NATO and the EU, which is a very dangerous game, and it's really coming back to bite them in the backside, if you excuse my English now.
James, I want to read something that, you wrote in the article, and I quote, 50 members of the European Parliament sent a letter to Scholz urging him to take a stand on the right side of the history. So in other words, again, this is something that you touch on briefly. As soon as the war broke out in Ukraine, and pretty much every single member within the NATO and also within the European countries that condemned this criminal like idea or this behavior from Vladimir Putin. But Chancellor Scholz refused to join the conversation or refused to take such actions. I guess you explain that reason is because this political ties or this anti-American establishment's idea that motivated him to refuse to take the stand against the Putin. But is there anything beyond what you just shared with us? So in other words, you think about it, if he is lining himself with Vladimir Putin or someone as Vladimir Putin, he's basically also playing a dangerous game with the international community, especially in the midst of the war, don't you think?
What you have to understand, Will, like all politics, it comes down to party politics. We like to think of our statesmen as doing things out of conviction and out of a duty to the world and so forth all too frequently. And we know this in every country. People actually act out of interest of how they're going to get elected next time. And the truth of the matter is Scholz knows damn well that he was only really became Chancellor because the voters of the extreme left party, now Germany has, unlike Britain or America, has 5 viable parties. He managed to persuade the voters of the hard left party, who were pretty unashamed about their kind of ongoing love of Lenin and their hatred of NATO. He managed to persuade about 850,000 of them to shift to his party. That was just enough to see him in. Without those votes, he would never have got it. And throughout his campaign to be elected last year, he refused every time to rule out a coalition with these guys, even though they're openly calling for the dissolution of NATO and so forth. So he is a prisoner in electoral, psephological terms. He is partly a prisoner of his own party's constituency, many of whom have this distinct admiration for, well, Bolshevism, communism, what you want to call it, and a distinct anti-Americanism. Now, and that's his problem. So he actually did announce, famously about a month ago, this great epochal change in German foreign policy, they called it, a Zeitenwende, literally meaning a change of the times. It was going to be a new epoch. And everyone was amazed, everyone was really glad, but then absolutely nothing happened. Until this weekend, finally, today, yesterday, finally we hear that Germany, the great fanfare, is going to send, well, they're going to send 50 10-year out-of-date anti-aircraft Panzers, which are frankly, most people would say these things are not only been in the garage for 10 years, but what use is a 35mm cannon against a T-72? Not much. Is it used against a drone? Probably not even. It's probably too big a caliber for a drone. It's a kind of symbol. They're not going to be much good. It's not what the Ukrainians wanted. They want proper battle tanks. So he's finally shifting, and it's not just me saying that. There are many politicians in Germany itself and commentators who are dismayed by this. His own coalition partners. It sounds bizarre to we in Britain and you in America probably, but the Green Party, who we regard in Britain usually as being fairly left wing and anti and pacifist, those guys are all gung ho for sending stuff. Yeah, they're actually the Green Party is much more bellicose than the Socialist Party. The Conservative Party has been crying for weeks for them to do more about it. So it's not just foreigners, there's people inside there. But unfortunately, as I say, that the SDP has this problem that it's imprisoned with this notion of a fear of being taken over by American, or it preceded by British in the 19th century, actually, but then it's transferred that to Americanization because it doesn't really know itself. It's ended up too much in hock, as we say in Britain, meaning in debt to its own ultra left wing, who are normally cauterized off into this separate little party called Die Linke. But Scholz, as I say, he got elected by appealing to those voters, and he's just too scared as a party politician to offend them too much. I suspect it's as simple as that. Because I say most politics, it comes down to which governor's going to get elected next time, who's going to be offended, are you going to lose voters by this and that policy? And there always have been over the years. Foreign observers are constantly amazed when the German population in general is asked which country they trust or distrust. They're constantly amazed at the levels of distrust of America and at the abnormal levels of sort of friendship towards Russia, which the Germans manifest. It's a real sort of national phenomenon, which unfortunately in this case is becoming a political barrier to action. And it's doing Germany's international standing an awful lot of bad. I mean, there are people in Southern Europe, for example, in Greece, Portugal, Spain. These guys were told after the financial crash 2010, and frankly, they were told largely by Germany, you have got to take a massive haircut on your economy now. You've got to suffer huge austerity because you've broken the financial rules to get your budget straight. But faced with an actual war, an invasion by Russia, the German government seems absolutely unwilling to take equivalent measures that might damage its own economy, like turn off the gas. Germany is so dependent on Russian gas that Germany pays Putin, I think it's $2.5 billion per month for gas. That's money which is paying for his mercenaries, paying for his new tanks, paying for keeping his people quiet. And Germany could turn it off, maybe not from one hour to the other, of course, but it could take the hit, because Germany, of all the countries in the world, any of your students who are economically literate will know this, can borrow at virtually nothing. It can borrow at the lowest rates of any major industrialized country. It can borrow as much as it wants, at about 0.4%, which is like free money, because it has such a huge export surplus. Everyone knows it. They could borrow enough to cushion their economy from any possible effects. In fact, to cushion the whole of Europe if they wanted to. Most people think it would just take 2 or 3 months of a total gas shutoff to bring Russia's war machine to a complete halt. The war could be won like that. Many people believe, but Germany does not seem able to sort of steel itself, because it doesn't seem to have the trust in its own social stability to do that. It's as though people, particularly in the SDP, are worried that, the slightest rise in unemployment, the slightest rise in inflation or government debt is somehow going to blow this whole society apart. Unlike the Greeks or the Portuguese, who were capable of taking massive cuts after 2010. And that's an interesting, that sense of national fragility is something which is very peculiarly German. They don't trust themselves to some extent. And that's not only the SDP, I think. There's this abiding fear in Germany because they've misunderstood their own history, I think, that if they don't start being the world's best people, they might just whisper it, stop being those Nazis again, you know? It's a deep fear in Germany, and it's for most Germans, it's totally unjustified, because most of them never did vote Nazi, we forget.
That's right.
Hitler's triumph was entirely contingent on that Eastern vote.
You know, James, it's so interesting as I was listening to how you describe this political ambition has completely blinded this political figure. You know, again, I think because the war in Ukraine, every single nation is standing at the crossroads. Not only that you are saying that domestically speaking in Germany, people are not trusting, or I guess even the politicians are losing their trust within this political party, but let's talk about something happening in the US as well. Back in 2016, when Donald Trump became the president for the country, and he brought this brand new idea, but this idea has actually been existed for so long, and this is what we called nationalism. But even in this political sense, that he crowned this term called nationalistic agenda. You know, at the beginning, when the people on the left, I guess we call them the Democrats, when they hear the word nationalistic agenda, and which means it's the opposite of liberalism. So in other words, they are going to close down the borders, and they are going to be anti-immigrants, and they're going to completely put American interests first. But because this nationalistic agenda, they elevated someone as Donald Trump to the next level. And again, we don't have to talk about this January 6th chaos, because that's a whole new chapter. But just based on what I said, James, from your perspective and looking at the party under Chancellor Scholz today, is there a nationalistic agenda within the pocket? And if so, what does that mean today in Germany in terms of understanding nationalism and the word democracy? Can you help us to understand those two things at the same time?
Absolutely. And the case is really very different in Germany. It's almost a mirror image, I would say. The problem with Germany is not that it's not nationalist enough. Sorry, it's not that it's too nationalist. It's the other way around. The Germans have not been confident enough. As you began rightly by saying, Germany is by far and away the biggest economy in Europe. It's the paymaster of the EU, without which the EU would not function. It's the world's export champion, maybe tipped by China, maybe not. And no other country has that economic penetration. You know, everyone wants a German car in the world, that sort of thing. Now, but they have been consistently unwilling to step up to that plate and punch their weight. Openly, because they seem to. There's this idea that they are pathologically non-nationalists, and there are times when, you know, it's good to have a sort of, I would call it realistic nationalism, which says that your country's interests are in fact best served by keeping the international order going. And that might need you to step up as a nation and pull your weight and not be scared to be leading Europe, which is Germany's natural role. It's easily the biggest country in terms of population as well. You know, it can't, and it seems quite weird. It's constantly hiding behind. Scholz keeps saying in Germany, you know, there's no room for sort of individual missions. That Germany can't pursue this on its own. Well, why can't it lead then? It seems that they want to hide behind this notion that we're all in this together, because there's this too much fear, which France, for example, doesn't have at all. The French have never been in the least scared about pulling their own, you know, yes, they support the EU, but they've never been at all scared about going their own way. You know, they broke with NATO in the 60s. They have their own nuclear deterrent and totally independent of Britain and America. Germany does seem scared of that. And it's not a kind of renewed nationalism in the sense of a Trumpian nationalism that would be the problem. It's simply they're not prepared to do a large-scale version of what you might call civic nationalism, which is like doing the right thing. Because they're too scared of being perceived by others and perceived of themselves as being too nationalist. There's this excessive desire for kind of peace at any price and to hide behind internationalist slogans, particularly on the SPD, which has always been that way inclined. Rather than actually admitting the fact that, look, Europe is a united bunch of nations each of which has its own interests, but whose interests are best served if they all stand up together against this extremely large and devouring imperialist nation whose intentions towards its neighbors, not just the Ukraine, have been made pretty public. You know, if they had just been able to march into Ukraine as they confidently expected they would, then, you know, what would the Poles and the Balts and the Finns be thinking right now? You know, they would be massing troops on their border desperately and asking for American troops to move to their borders right now. So we've been given a breathing space by Ukraine. It's a breathing space which Germany, of all countries, should be standing up to lead, and not as an autarkic national power who's only after its own good, but as a power which recognizes that its own good is in fact in keeping Europe and the world order, which is very profitable to Germany, going. Germany needs the liberal world order. As an export power, Germany needs free trade. It needs a rule-based system more than probably any other country in the world. It can't afford to play around with, you know, fantasies, which the British are as well a bit, of being, you know, lock ourselves off from world trade. We'll do it on our own. Britain first, America first, whatever. Those kind of weird things just harm world trade in the end. And Germany, as the world's export Meister, they call themselves, they need that to keep going more than anyone else. So it's in their own interest to ensure the survival of the liberal world order. And they should be standing up for that. They are moving, but it's very slow.
James, I want to go back to the article that, again, something that you wrote. And again, it's amazing that how you pinpointed some of the critical matters within the country. Now, this is what you wrote. I quote, Germany's national fearfulness, it's not xenophobic, but Germanophobic. And they, or rather a specific larger group of them, are worried that the moment they stop being absolutely on their guard, terrible things will happen. Now, sounded to me is, again, you know, we're looking at one of the countries that, again, you could say, one of the largest economies in Europe. And again, when we look at the history, Germany, this country, used to dominate almost the world. I mean, it terrifies the entire world just to think about this political ambition and the political figure. But today, that based on what you wrote, and you say, again, if I interpreted the message well, it's the people, they're absolutely anxious about anything that terrible could happen if they stop, you know, being absolutely on their guard. So, James, what does that mean? Does that mean this today's political parties or national identities, it's in deep crisis? And if that's so, how should the NATO's or how should any other countries continue to work comfortably with the country of Germany, you know, in terms of politically or economically? Why would you write that way? Well,
that's precisely, you put your finger on it there, and that's precisely what my book on German history ends up with a plea for. It's a plea for us to truly understand, for Europeans and Germans to understand their own history. This sense of worry about what they might turn into themselves is, of course, based on the history of Nazism. There are still people alive who remember the terrible things done in the name of Germany. And in two generations since the First World War, 3 generations, maybe 4, have been schooled very assiduously. The Germans have been great about this in talking about their own problem and acknowledging the horrors of the Third Reich and making sure it can never happen again and so forth. One of the problems with that is that it's been a kind of blanket guilt. And it has not, they've always addressed the problem as the Germans chose Hitler. The Germans did this. Therefore, all the Germans. Now, and if you look at the electoral map, say, of 1930, 1931, 1932, when Hitler's taking power, these are the decisive, terrible years of the collapse of German democracy. Nothing could be clearer than the fact that all comes from a specific part of Germany. It comes from the east. The southwestern Catholic regions of Germany never give Hitler a majority, ever. In the far east of Germany, in what's now Russia and Poland, they give him enormous majorities. And it's their votes that get him in. His decisive breakthrough to a national state, however, this is probably the most important point in terms of Scholz and the SPD, It's when Hitler finally manages to break through to a national status rather than just the heir of the authoritarian East, is that Protestant voters in North Germany switch to him. Not all of them by any means, but enough of them to give him a national majority. And that, I think, is the key to this fearfulness in the SPD. They know, frankly, they know very well that their constituency, as I write in the article in foreignpolicy.com, if you imagine the Venn diagram, your listeners can probably do this. Here's a circle saying SPD vote. In Venn diagram terms, that circle exists totally within a larger circle, which is North German Protestants. They don't all vote SDP, but almost all the SDP votes come from them. But unfortunately, a large number of them, of the Northern German Protestants, switched to Hitler in those vital years. And it's that plus the massive votes in the East which made it possible for him to take power. If every German, to put it polemically and simply, if every German had voted the way people in Bonn or Munich vote, Hitler would never have got to power. So he's backed by this bloc of the East, but assisted at the vital moment by switchers from the North German Protestants, milieu. Now, and I think that lurks in the back of the SPD to this day. So they're split between their own there's a hard left element within them, which is clung on to that notion of anti-Americanism, socialist internationalism. But there's deep in their own hearts, there's this sense that they're not really sure of their own electorate, because they know that once in the past, at a vital moment, they did actually swing to the bad guys, so to speak. And that was a vital time for them. So I think that Germany could free itself in a way from its own history, and the rest of us could stop throwing the Third Reich in Germany's face all the time, if we actually look at German history properly and realize that Hitler only came to power because of certain Germans, not all of them by any chance, not any means, and that what we used to call West Germany, right up to reunification, the Federal Republic of Germany. It wasn't a Nazi-free zone in terms of voters, but it was an area where the Nazis never, ever got more than about 35%, ever, even at the height of Hitler's power. Whereas what was the old East Germany, there are places there where he was getting like 70% in free elections. So the Germans, because they have swamped themselves understandably with this cultural guilt, but it's been a too indiscriminate cultural guilt. By not understanding their own history, they have made people who really don't need to be guilty or on their guard against being Nazis feel guilty about it. And that's meant that even people who are absolutely wedded to the Western political alliance, the Western political tradition, they still feel constrained by this fear of acting like that, of stepping up and acting in the way, say, France would, as a major player. Because they still feel it's inappropriate for Germany to do that, and they're wrong completely. And without Europe needs a confident Germany, which is confident that it's no longer in any danger of becoming a Nazi place, because most of it never really was.
James,
we forget. So again, looking at maps, you forget that those large areas which gave Hitler 60-70% votes, they're gone. They're not even in the old East Germany. They're in Poland and Russia now. They're gone forever. 17 million Germans from those areas, either were kicked out or killed by the Russians. Those areas, those eastern areas of Germany, simply no longer exist on a map. So the constituency, the electorate that gave Hitler his power, just doesn't exist anymore.
James, again, I know you're very busy, but I got two more questions before letting you go. Now, today, fast forward, we're looking at this political party in the United States. It's completely different from when we are looking at the period of 1945 or 1942, the World War II. But so my next question is, fast forward, how much does the U.S. can influence this political shift in Germany today? So in other words, we know that since Chancellor Scholz took over this political party or the nation, a lot of rumors on the street that he's going to be much tougher and he's going to be more difficult and in terms of dealing with political foes or dealing with political opponents, etc. But again, so far we have not seen any practical or feasible behaviors coming out of the party in terms of the foreign affairs. So, James, from your perspective, how much can we expect that this Western political influence will have on the Germans' political changes today?
I think we can be confident. And I'll tell you why, because we in Britain and America tend to overestimate the power of individual chancellors for a simple reason. The party systems are so different there. They have proportional representation. We all know the Chancellor Kohl is only Chancellor because he is a Chancellor in a coalition government, which includes the Greens and the free markets, the free market warriors of the FDP. It's a bizarre coalition in many ways. And even with that coalition, he's only just in power. He is not an all-powerful figure like an American or French president at all. I mean, you know, he's maybe you could compare him with an American president who has both the senators and the congressmen all against him. He really has very little. His coalition partners are far keener to play a leading role in this and to be full partners of acting against Russia and so forth. I suspect his own days are limited. He may, if he loses the trust of his own coalition partners, they may do new elections where I'm fairly sure he'd be kicked out. And so I don't think he's long for this political political theatre. And I don't think we need to fear the power, because the overwhelming majority of Germans, which would be the three other big parties, the CDU, the Greens, and the FDP, all of those guys are absolutely unambiguously pro-NATO, pro-West, anti-Russian. He happens to run a coalition government, but it's a very different kettle of fish from say, a British Prime Minister or an American president. He does not have that. And because, of course, America is very federal. Sorry, Germany is even more strongly federal than America. He just doesn't have that kind of national power even that an American president has. He doesn't have the power to declare war and things like that at all. So there's no need to fear him. The whole of Germany, overwhelmingly in the polls, including his own party members, really, most of them are behind NATO, are behind the West. There's no danger of Germany falling by the wayside. It's just that they need pushing, and Germans themselves are saying this. He needs the pressure to be kept up and say this is not good enough. It's happening right now. The Ramstein base in the American Ramstein base in southern Germany. And I'm quite sure that right now he is being quietly read the riot act to by his American allies. And I would be very surprised if we don't end the day with some more spectacular sounding announcements from him, because he's been pushed into a corner by most of his own allies in the coalition and by America, and by the rest of Europe. And he's not going to be able to hold this line much longer. So I think we don't need to worry about that. James, what will happen if there's a new American administration in a couple of years is, of course, a different matter.
Well, but right now, with everything going on in Ukraine right now, and I want to say everything is still up in the air. Now, I want to end our conversation with something that I know you have been working on series of books, again, entitled The Shortest History of Many Countries. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think you're also working on a book regarding the country of Ireland. Is that right?
That's my next book is The Shortest History of Ireland. That's
very
right.
Good. So, James, can you help us to understand why are you spending your chunk of time, or why are you interested in writing the book on the shortest history of Ireland? And also, again, at the intro, you mentioned that there was another project that you're also working on, and very proudly. So, again, let's start with the first one. Why interested in Ireland?
I had my first university job in Ireland. My wife is Irish. The histories of Ireland and England are famously entwined. Ireland is just this incredible country, and it's only 5 million, for God's sake. And when you think how much it punches above its weight in terms of international brand awareness, let's say, what country of 5 million has so many people in the world doing St. Patrick's Day parades and such like? It's a country which it is fascinating that a country so small can have such international awareness, and it has such an extraordinary history. Again, a misunderstood one. So I want to try to tell the story of that as an outsider, as I did with Germany, but trying to give people a new perspective on their own history. Just to take a really simple example, every Irishman will tell you that, in 1169, England first invaded Ireland. Well, it wasn't England at all. The guys who invaded were French speakers from Wales.
Wow.
So there are these huge misunderstandings that go along. And I hope to end the book with a real suggestion as to, it's secret as yet, as to how to solve the problem of Northern Ireland. I've run it past a senior diplomat already, and he thinks it might be a flyer. So I hope to end with a kind of really big intervention in the future of Ireland here. So it's exciting stuff. And I'm doing there's a big series running right now, in fact, on the BBC called Art That Made Us. It's the history of the British Isles through works of art. It's all over the BBC right now. And I have the glorious title of story consultant on that, because I was a novelist before I wrote history books. I'm fundamentally concerned with how a big story like the history of Germany or of England or Ireland hangs together. Can I give that what the guys in the UCLA Film School would call an arc? Can I split it into 3 acts? Who's the protagonist? What's the story all about? Where are the choice points? All these things I love as a writer of fiction. I believe you can actually use them. It doesn't mean I'm writing fictions. It means that I'm trying to communicate the history of a place to people with all the drama of a story.
Well, James Hawes, and again, he's the author of the latest book. It's called The Shortest History of Germany, from Julius Caesar to Angela Merkel. And also, I strongly encourage everyone to go read James' article. Again, it's on the foreign policy. It's entitled The Real Reason Germany is Always Afraid Berlin Hesitates on Everything Because of Its Ruling Party's Identity Problems. James, it's been a pleasure of speaking to you, and thank you so much for taking your time to join the show. And by talking to you, it helps us indeed understand the current political identity in Germany, and also why, and I think the most important thing is why that today the Chancellor Scholz has refused, reluctantly to show his attitude, especially regarding the war in Ukraine. But again, overall, James, thank you so much for doing this, and we'd love to have you back on the show for the future episodes regarding the fate of the country